We started by saying that in that evangelisation sort of stage, the category of witness is crucial, right? And then underneath that category of witness, we talked about a number of different things. The second dimension of that stage is around the proclamation of the gospel, and I'm going to get to that as the third point here, but I think that there are three, what we might say, intersecting stories that can be helpful here, and that we would want to provide as a context, or provide a context in which those three stories can be told and articulated. So the first one is the story of young people themselves. So what I've called a personal narrative, what I mean by that is a personal and a historical account of how something came to be. So if something's a narrative, it's historical. It'll be some kind of sense of here's the circumstances that led up to something, here's what happened, and here's what it means going forward, right? So it's actually grounded in history. Charles Taylor will say that it's through my story, my personal narrative, that I define my identity, and that this is central to being a self. So what he's getting at here is that part of the process of identity formation, of describing and defining who I am, I do that in dialogue with others, but I actually articulate and tell my own story, okay? And that this is actually how I work out who I am. The psychologist Daniel McAdams puts it this way in relation to young people. He says it's in adolescence that teenagers begin to see their lives in storied historical terms, okay? What he's suggesting there is that up until around adolescence, wherever that might start, okay, so these days perhaps as young as 12 years of age, and maybe even a little earlier, young people don't necessarily have the capacity, a child doesn't necessarily have the capacity partly to think historically and therefore to be able to tell their own story in a full kind of say. They can talk about an event, a discrete experience that happened to them, but an actual story of who they are is something that actually emerges in adolescence. What this means is that being able to tell my own story is particularly important for making meaning in my life, because narrative enables us to articulate and make sense of insights that come from our personal experience. And these insights are generative of meaning in our lives. So you can have an insight, and you can try and formulate an insight as an assertion, okay? But the insight is actually best conveyed through a narrative, as the story can capture experience, the insight emerging from that experience, and the preceding or background circumstances that made the experience significant. So I just try and name the insight without being able to say, here's why it mattered, by looking at where I've come from to that point. The insight won't have its potency or force in the same kind of way, nor what I now understand for it to mean. What's its significance for me going forward? I want to suggest that in the cultural context we find ourselves in, learning to tell one's own story can be quite difficult because of the fragmentation of life. It's not necessarily easy. So quite often you hear a young person say, I remember saying this myself as an adolescent, that I felt like I was with one particular group of people, say my family, I felt like I was one person. With another group, say my peers at school, I was another person. With the people, my friends at the YMCA where I worked, I felt like I was another person, right? What's going on there is that I've actually got kind of, as it were, different parts, the different dimensions of myself. The capacity for me to then bring them together to tell a kind of unified, coherent story of myself is a really critical task, but not so easy for a young person to do. And so there's something really valuable in being able to help young people to be able to articulate their story in that way. This reminds me of a particular practice in youth ministry that I first met myself when I did my year term retreat. Has stayed with me, and I've done it, I don't know, probably 100 times since with young people, which is something like what's sometimes called a map of my life journey. So some people might have encountered this. The best evidence I could find for its origins are with the Marist retreat teams of the States in the 70s, but it still keeps getting used, and I still think it's got much to commend itself. It's that you draw a little road, and then you, rather than sort of say, well, you know, here's my house, and I'm literally drawing a picture of my house, you might draw your house if your family was one of those families where everybody was always welcome and anyone could come in and come round, you'd draw it with a big door, so to symbolise that lots of people could come in. You might draw big windows as a sign that people were always welcome and that kind of thing. Or if you're a really, sort of pretty self-contained kind of family for whatever reason, you might draw a little narrow house and a small door and that kind of thing. So you're using a symbol to describe something of your story, and then the map would continue over different stages of your life. You might describe good times with sunshine, bad times with a cloud. You might describe key moments or events along that journey. So the moment we start talking about journey, we start talking about a story, right? So what we're asking a young person to do as they articulate this story is we're asking them to say, give us a kind of a coherent sense of how you came to be here, talking about key moments in your life, key experiences, but also the key relationships that have framed you and shaped you. When we help a young person do that, we're helping them articulate that narrative, arguably for the first time, because it's not necessarily often that people are given a situation or a place where they get an opportunity to do that. But if Taylor's right, and I think he is, this is actually really crucial in having a sense of myself, that I'm not just a conglomeration of other people's relationships, but over and above that, I actually have a sense of who I am in relation to others. So I'm not so much being defined by others as I'm actually working out who I am in relationship with others. A narrative helps me to be able to name and articulate that. So I think that's really valuable practice. The last step in that practice sometimes can be to say, well, looking back, however you might understand God, however you might conceive of the divine, can you name or identify some moments where you feel like God was present to you? And some young people may say, look, I really can't do that. And some might be able to point to some moments and pick certain moments. Others might be able to say, look, I can consistently see how God's been at work in my life in that way. What we're inviting people to do there is that in that narrative, we're inviting them to understand it and see it in the light of God's presence in some way. So that's the personal story of a young person. The second story is the story of other young people, and not necessarily young people, of their story, their personal narrative in the light of faith. And that's commonly been called testimony, okay? When someone shares their testimony, when they talk about the story of how God has been at work in their lives, what they're offering, I think, is a model of how they're living their life within the interpretive landscape of Christian faith, as it were. So what they're actually saying is, I understand myself, my story, in the light of the Christian story, of what God has done for us in Jesus and through the Spirit. That reference to the interpretive landscape comes from a guy called Frank Rogers, who's written a great book called God in the Graffiti. God in the Graffiti. When young people hear someone else's testimony, what it invites them to discover is what faith might look like in their own lives, what a life shaped by God looks like for them. So what's being offered is both an example. If they can see something or hear something of their story in the story of another person, it helps them to be able to say, oh, maybe I can see how faith might shape and change and affect and influence my life. But it also gives them a language. It also gives them words to be able to name experiences for themselves, to be able to articulate what they would like or what they've experienced. I think one of the best categories for testimony, like when we think, some theologians, some authors will talk about testimony and they'll recognise its origins perhaps in the law court, right? That someone offers a testimony, a witness offers a testimony to say, well, I saw the accident, it happened like this, or I saw the robbery and it looked like that. Avery Dulles, the great American theologian, I think doesn't deny any of that, but I think he gives it a richer Christian foundation when he says that the fundamental testimony of Christian faith is actually the first witnesses to the resurrection, so particularly the women sharing what they have seen. That's the fundamental witness and the fundamental testimony for Christians. And of course, just as a little footnote, the women's testimony, of course, wouldn't have been, it wasn't recognised or accepted as permissible evidence in a law court in the time of Jesus. It's one of those little things that perhaps points to the truth of the gospel in some way, or the truth of the resurrection accounts, because If you were going to make it up, you wouldn't have made women the witnesses, but it's really clear that for the authors of the Gospels, Jesus appeared to women. They couldn't be fudged away or erased or obscured in some way. It was too deeply embedded in the story to be washed out, as it were. So that just shifts that whole sense of testimony being something about giving evidence before a court, as it were, and it's much more about my personal sharing of my experience of another person, namely the risen Jesus. That also takes us to the heart of what testimony might look like. It doesn't necessarily have to be, sometimes we think testimony, we might more narrowly define it as it's really fundamentally about how I came to faith, okay? And it certainly can include that. But we might also find it helpful to expand the category of testimony a little bit out a little bit further, to be able to say, it's what are the stories of grace in my life that continue, that I might give witness to how God's working in my life now as a 44-year-old man, rather than, you know, that sort of narrower sense of testimony where I point to when I was 16, 17 years of age, and the key moments where my faith became my own and not just the faith of my family. It's being able to say, God's grace is obviously still at work in my life, and I can share how God's at work in those moments too. So I want to just gently suggest there that we might expand our sense of what the category of testimony means, even though fundamentally it will be about our encounter with the risen Jesus. But of course, we don't just have one of those. We continue to encounter the risen Lord in our midst. Brings us to the kerygma. And we talked about the kerygma in the light of the RCIA at some length. This is the proclamation of the gospel. So the word kerygma in Greek means proclamation, and it's the proclamation of the good news of who Jesus is. One of the things that I want to say about that is it's really important that we don't rush to this too prematurely. This is crucial, okay? And I think often in our church, this has been a piece that's been missing, and this is why we've had lots of people, not just the young, not come to faith, is because they actually haven't heard the gospel. But we can rush to it. And perhaps for those of us for whom the kerygma is central to our understanding of how people come to faith in Christ, we can want to jump to that really quickly before we've had a chance for that, the power of that testimony, of that witness to actually have its impact. That people have got to trust us first before we can tell the story of Jesus, okay? So we want trust to be established between those young seekers, where they're actually, in a sense, asking us to tell the story, rather than us imposing that before they're ready to ask the question. How might we describe the gospel? I went looking and I found Thomas Aquinas' description of the gospel quite helpful. It comes from the letter to the Romans, his commentary on the letter to the Romans. And Thomas says that it's fundamentally, this is Thomas just taking a real classic theological step backwards and getting a bit technical, but I think it's really helpful for a reason that'll become clear in a moment. He says it's about the proclamation of the union of God and humanity in Jesus. The union of God and humanity in Jesus. What does that look like then when that gospel is actually played out in the lives of individual personal human beings? Well, it looks like forgiveness and the adoption of those people as children of God through the deifying action of the Spirit, in other words, through the action of the Spirit that brings us into the life of God's love, into the triune life of God. Why I think Thomas's definition is really helpful here is that it serves as a valuable corrective to a narrow presentation of the gospel that too sharply portrays salvation as only pertaining to individuals. Notice that what he says is it's the union of humanity and God in the person of Jesus. And so it's about all of humanity being brought into the life of God. And so the reason why, if we just make it about this person coming to hear the gospel and responding as an isolated kind of individual, as it were, what that easily can lend it to is we understand salvation to mean something like the removal of a chosen few from the wreckage of a sinful world. It becomes kind of this, Jesus comes to pluck some people up and out, right? The problem with that is that that's fundamentally unbiblical. It's actually not faithful to the scriptural witness. Jesus comes to rescue the human race. Jesus comes to, if someone like Henri de Lubac will say, drawing upon the fathers of the church, those first theologians commenting upon the scriptures, de Lubac will say that for the fathers, it's all of humanity that actually falls in Adam, okay? And it's all of humanity that's restored to a new life with God in Christ, the second Adam. I think this is really helpful and really important because it actually makes sure that our depiction of salvation is big enough, that it actually encompasses God's intention for the whole of humanity and through humanity to the whole created order. So it's not kind of like a, beam me up, Scotty, for a few isolated individuals, but it's what God has done for the whole of the human race. Now, that has to be personally appropriated by individual people, okay? That has to be personally appropriated by individual people. But we want to make sure that we understand it in the context of this is something that God is doing for the whole of his created order and not just for a chosen or select few. One of the other things that I think might be helpful here too is that sometimes the age of authenticity, remember that idea of that we've got to realise our humanity ourselves, we've got to work out what it means to be truly human. Some versions of that ethic of being authentic and true to yourself it'll get captured in slogans like be all you can be, or be the best version of you, and that kind of thing. There's a bit of a risk that Christian faith can kind of unwittingly collude with that. And so what we end up with there is kind of like Christianity sort of blesses, or Christian faith really becomes an exercise in self-fulfillment. Be the best version of you. Jesus sets you free to be the best you can be. Now, while those things aren't entirely untrue, what it can do is it can reframe the gospel in a very therapeutic kind of way that says, what the gospel is good for is making me feel better about myself, okay? And I think that that's a problem because, again, it's not faithful to the vision, the difficult vision of the way and path to our true humanity is actually the self-denial of the cross. It's actually giving up my life out of love for the sake of others. That this is the path of discipleship. And so, yes, it is about discovering who I truly am in God, but the pathway to that is actually self-sacrificing love. When the gospel, or what appears to be the gospel, is too tightly wed to our age, our current age of authenticity, what it becomes, the cross is evacuated from that and just says, God will make you the best version of you. And there's no pathway there that is involved in selfless loving of others. Okay. So this is not to say that when we proclaim the gospel, we're not saying to young people, there's a response for you to make of faith and belief in what God has done for us in Jesus. That's exactly part of what's going on. But it's to recognise that we're putting it in terms of this is what God has done for the whole world, and you can say yes to your participation in that mystery. Okay? That might feel like a little bit of a subtle distinction. We can come back to it in a few moments if you like, but I think it's really crucial because I think we do a disservice to the gospel, and therefore we also do a disservice to young people if we kind of make it about them. The gospel is actually about the whole of humanity, the whole of the created order. Okay? And so it's much more important that we be faithful to that, knowing that young people make their response within that and to that, but we're inviting them for them to be caught up in a mystery that's much bigger than themselves. Don't follow Jesus because of what he just does for you personally, right? Follow Jesus because of what he does to transform the world, to restore it to the original intention of the Father. You might like to ask some more questions about that. The response that arises from that proclamation is a response of faith and of initial conversion. And so drawing upon the RCIA here, when we looked at that moment by which somebody enters into the catechumenate, we were saying that there are some qualities of what an initial conversion looks like. And they're initial. It's a beginning, it's a taste of the love that God has for us. It's a beginning of a sense of sin and of forgiveness from that sin. It's the beginning of a recognition that I have a relationship with God. It's the beginning of an awareness of the Christian community and the importance of the church. It's a beginning of a sense that actually there's a life of faith, a life that involves moral decision making that flows from that encounter with God. It's all very initial. It's a beginning, okay? And so that initial conversion is where we respond with faith and say, yeah, I do believe as best I can, and it doesn't have to be a full and complete yes yet, but I've encountered, I've tasted, experienced something of the love of God. And so now, at this point, I'm hungry to know more. I want to learn. I want to grow. I want to deepen in what I've experienced, okay? If someone was an unbaptized adult was in that process, that would be the moment where they would enter into the catechumenate, stage 2. For young people, I want to suggest that this is a moment where they have to transition from one mode of ministry to another mode of ministry, and that they might be two separate events, if you like, or two separate experiences, okay? Because what a young person needs in that first stage that we've been talking about up until this point and what they need going forward don't look quite the same. As I was saying before, you can teach in this second stage, what I've called the formation stage, and young people are ready to kind of hear it. There's a wrong way to do it in a way that they'll still go, back off, that's way too kind of telling me. But there's a way to teach in a way that young people will be hungry and lap it up because they've had a taste and an experience. Whereas prior they wouldn't be able to receive that. They wouldn't hear it because that other dynamic of you can't tell me what to believe is much stronger, okay? So there's an initial conversion that happens here. I chose the picture there very deliberately because in the RCIA, one of the key symbols of the entry into the catechumenate is a presentation of a cross. And there's the two main symbols as I read it are, one is that you start outside the church, but the beginning of the entry into the catechumenate, and then you come into the main body of the church. And the second one is the presentation of a cross. What we're inviting people into here is to model themselves on the death and resurrection of Jesus, that in the catechumenate, the reception of the cross symbolises we're going to learn what it means to live by the Paschal mystery, by the mystery of Jesus' death and resurrection. As I said, it's initial, and so we don't have to expect, again, at this point, we don't have to expect young people to be completely committed in every aspect and respect. They're still on a journey, very much on a journey, and it's the beginning of an important stage, a new stage in that journey. What are the characteristics of that journey? The first one would be to say that there's a consolidation of that initial conversion, okay? And we've talked about that where the initial conversions around the intellectual and the affective and the moral and the socio-political, they become the development of the virtues of faith, hope, love and justice. That when these conversions are happening within the context of Christian faith, what's growing in me is I'm deepening as a person of faith. I'm growing in hope, I'm growing in love, I'm growing in the practice of justice. There's much more that we could say about that, but there's a bit to cover, so if you want to come back to that, we can. But I think that's the goal, if you like, is that this time is a time for a maturing of that initial conversion, okay? Will it be completed while young people are part of a youth ministry? It'd be a good question for us to throw around. I think the answer to that might be sometimes. I think I've met young people who've come out of their experience of youth ministry and they still have a maturing as people to go, right? But they actually, you can point to their lives where you say, you know what, I can see really strong evidence of each of those virtues in their life, okay? But I think for most young people, probably that journey continues onwards. And of course, in one sense, it's a lifelong journey. But in terms of the maturing of an initial conversion, I think sometimes we might see it. Other times it might be that those different dimensions still takes time. And part of that's because of there's a human maturing that's going on with that maturing in conversion as well. We can circle back around to that if you want to throw that around a little bit more. What else has to happen in the formation stage? You might remember that when I spoke about the RCIA, I said that in the catechumenate there are 4 key things, okay? And I think that the order or the priority about which we think of these things really matters. That in this stage, young people who are catechumens, they're first of all to experience the life of the Christian community. Then that's number 1. They're also supposed to experience the mission of the Christian community, and they're also to experience the worship of the Christian community with the exception of being admitted into Eucharist, okay? The liturgy of the Eucharist is the only part that they can't partake of, on that journey to adult initiation. Then the fourth part is instruction, or what's sometimes classically called catechesis, where they're learning about what we believe, okay? So 4 dimensions: sharing in the life of the Christian community, its mission and its worship, and then there's instruction or teaching based upon that. What I think often happens in the RCIA is we only do number 4. We gather a little group together and we teach them about what we believe, right? I think that same thing can happen in youth ministry, okay? What that can create is a little silo. With adults, it can be the little RCIA group is having a rich experience, but it's tangential or even maybe separated from the rest of the Christian community's life, worship and mission. A similar thing can happen in youth ministry, where the youth group is actually, there's a great experience of life and mission and prayer in the youth group, but it's actually separated from the rest of the life of the parish or whatever other faith community it might be. The problem with that, of course, is that when you graduate, in inverted commas, when you're baptised for an adult, or when as a young person you're actually now too old for the youth group, you've actually not been immersed into the life of the faith community, okay? So when we speak here of young people's participation in the community, we really want to mean the whole of the faith community. Doesn't mean there's not a place for something specific, age specific for this particular group of young people, but it'd be great and really important if that flowed in and out of the broader faith community's life, mission, and prayer. Now, what can that look like? I think one of the first things that what it does is it makes for a huge challenge for our parishes, because often our parishes don't have enough communal life, they don't have a rich enough expression of mission, and maybe their worship doesn't have everything it should have in order to really celebrate and glorify God's presence amongst us. And so what happens there is that there just isn't enough there. But a vibrant parish community or some other sort of faith community, it ought to be that young people can actually participate in something that the rest of the community is doing as well. Its life, its mission, its prayer. When it does that, young people aren't kind of segmented away, but they're actually an integral part of the faith community, and they're being initiated into the whole of the life of the faith community. This presents a massive challenge. But I actually really think that the ultimate fruit, the ultimate fruitfulness of what we do with young people depends upon us getting this bit right. So I was saying to the youth ministry leaders down at St Declan's last Friday, they had a day working through, it was a formation kind of day, and I said to them, look, I've spent a bit of time being a youth minister, and I spent a bit of time thinking and working in youth ministry, so you'll probably be a bit surprised that you haven't seen a lot of me down at youth group. And I said the reason for that is that as parish priest, I think the best thing I can do is try and make sure that the rest of the parish is as thoroughly living out its mission, its life as a community, its life of prayer, so that what happens at youth group is aligned with what happens in the parish. And that in some ways, this is perhaps overstretching a little bit, but in many parishes, I think this is often true, is that what's required actually often enough is that when we talk about an alignment between the youth ministry and the parish, what we're actually saying is that the parish has to move to do what a good youth ministry is doing, okay? That the parish has to be the one that shifts to align itself. And so part of what I've been saying, I've been trying to do at St Declan's, is that I'm actually being a youth minister by trying to lead the parish as a whole as best I can to make sure that those three things are as rich as they possibly can be. Okay, there's much more that could be said about that too, but I'm conscious of time and needing to just try and just hit a couple of high notes of these other bits. We talked in the RCIA about the value of liminal experiences. So this is part of understanding the RCIA as a ritual process, by which what happens is that there are rites which kind of separate a person from their previous way of life, and then they move into a space of being betwixt and between. They're not yet a full Christian, but they're on that journey, but they also can't go back to where they were before. And in that spot, there's room for great kind of transformation at a human kind of level, okay? That there's something that can happen in someone's identity. And so this is the place for experiences like camps and conferences and retreats, mission trips. These are things that take people out of their normal life experience for a short period of time and offer them a particular experience of Christian community, okay, by which they actually get a taste and they see what it looks like, as it were, in a kind of an intense kind of way of what Christian life looks like for a short period of time. And that can be incredibly powerful and transformative for them, okay? So I think that there's a really important place in this stage especially. It could happen quite often. Remember I talked about Antioch? So the Antioch weekend was a liminal experience right at the very front in that first stage. I think there can be a place for that. It's just a lot harder for a young person to commit to that early these days, okay? If you take the analogy of Alpha, 7 weeks into the Alpha process, there's theoretically a weekend away, right? So it's after you've been on a particular journey for a little while, then there's an opportunity for a liminal experience. You go away for the weekend out of the normal rhythm and routine to focus in a particular way and to have a ritual kind of experience. One of the things, what could some of those rituals kind of look like? I think some of those rituals, I think in the RCIA, the 2 key rituals are what's kind of somewhat scarily sometimes called the minor exorcisms, which are really prayers for anything that's not of God to be left behind. I think that's the simplest way to kind of describe it. And then there's also a prayer of blessing by which somebody is we're praying for them to experience and encounter God more fully and the life of love and peace that he wants to give to them. Interesting analogy there for many of us in the room who are particularly familiar with kind of prayer ministry. So on Alpha, we pray with people that they'd be filled with the Holy Spirit, Life in the Spirit seminars, like a little prayer team praying for somebody. There's all sorts of contexts where this is a particularly typical kind of thing that happens. Interestingly, I think it has like a nice, at least an analogy, and maybe we could even say its roots in that process of praying for someone to be, something like the prayer of blessing for a catechumen. Maybe, okay? So you could, if you want to push back and say that I'm drawing too big a connection there, I'll possibly take that criticism. But I think there's a nice kind of point of connection there myself. There are other kinds of rituals and ways that we could, and other ritual experiences. I know, many of us know the ministry of the Youth Mission Team, and one of their, key little ritual experiences, we have a member of the Youth Mission Team with us today. One of the key kind of little rituals that they do is that they'll often do a little candle lighting ceremony. It's a little ritual moment where a young person goes up and lights a candle, and it can symbolise a number of different things. It could symbolise a deep yes to Jesus, or a desire to know God more, or wanting more light in my life. The symbolic action can be multivalent, have multiple symbols in it, but it can be a powerful kind of way for a young person it's a liminal kind of moment where they're actually being changed by that experience. It's not just symbolising something, it's actually changing them through the process. Okay. So I've very deliberately come to what's, often, in some ways, the whole of what I've been talking about is catechesis, rather than just the teaching. So when a young person is experiencing the life of the Christian community, hanging out with, having a meal with other people of faith, when a young person is joining in the soup kitchen, or when they're actually leading a game in the youth ministry, or when they're actually praying with somebody else, they're actually joining in the mission of the community, right? When they're praying, learning how to pray at Eucharist, that's all catechesis in the biggest sense of that. I think there's an analogy here with the way that education has come to be understood, and efforts to correct this, where often what has happened is that education, the kind of idea of education, has been reduced to just the cognitive imparting of information. Whereas education in its richest sense has always been, if you go back to, say the Greek, to the Greeks even, education was something about the whole person, okay? The whole person was shaped and changed and formed, and you learned a lot more about that by actually being with the teacher. This is Jesus' own model of formation, right? So Jesus taught, but I dare say that the disciples learnt far more about what it meant to be a follower of his by hanging out with him, by spending time with him, by watching what he did. and then being invited to participate in that themselves. So the first three things we've talked about, participation in the community's life, mission and prayer, is actually a form of education or a form of catechesis. This instruction is, what I've said here is catechesis in a very narrow sense, is just that part where I think what it should be really is actually explicating or unpacking what they've actually been living. Remember that in the catechumenate, the fundamental metaphor for this period is not the classroom, not what we're doing right now, but it's actually like an apprenticeship. It's like learning from a builder by watching what the builder does, then being told that you can hammer in this nail, and then by being told that you can put up this wall, and so on. It's an apprenticeship kind of model, and that's what's going on here. So there's a change that's got to happen here a bit too, I think, where perhaps our model of youth ministry often enough is a few games, someone gives a talk, and then we discuss the talk. Okay? There is a place for that. But gee, it's got to be embedded in a bigger thing of young people experiencing and learning from others by spending time with them. Learning how to pray by being with others who are praying. Learning how to do mission by doing mission and not talking about it. Learning how to be in Christian community and relating to one another by being in Christian community and relating to one another. Is it beneficial to talk about those things? Absolutely. But gee, it's much more powerful if you talk about something that someone's had an experience of rather than giving them a theory before they've had the experience. Do you hear the shift there? Okay, good. I'm just going to do this really, we could say so much more about these last 2 points and we don't have time, sadly, but I think it's really important that in that time of, as it were, teaching, if you like, that we want to foster critical engagement and that we want to recognise that there's a place for doubt. Remember that we said in the age of authenticity, one of the things that's happened there, that as we've had this supernova of possible responses to the question of faith, so we have two poles, which is the first pole is I'm a deeply committed Christian believer, and the other pole is maybe we might say a militant kind of atheism. Okay, there's a whole gamut of responses between those two, right? Taylor uses the metaphor of a supernova very deliberately to say it's like a galaxy of responses. Okay, when that happens, if I make a response of faith, whether I'm a young person or not, I know that there's also other people out there. Often people that are not out there very far, but there are people that I love. There are people in my family, they're my friends, who don't share that faith. And so the possibility there, and it works the other way too. For somebody who's said, absolutely, I do not believe, you can't, even if there's no one in their life who's a committed person of faith, the possibility of an alternative perspective is actually embedded into our reality, which means that doubt can't be viewed as this scary thing that's about to send a young person out of the life of faith or the church. When a young person voices doubts in youth group, often enough that's a moment for panic. Oh my gosh, I don't know how to answer their doubts. I don't know how to respond to that. I'm not sure what to say. They're about to leave. Their parents are going to really come down on me like a ton of bricks if they're the parents of deep faith. I don't know what to do with this, and we panic in that moment. But I want to suggest that those moments are actually really important, and they don't go away. That doesn't mean that I can't have a deep confidence. We might even go as far as to say a certain kind of certainty in the power of the gospel, a certain kind of certain faith that I believe and I trust in this. I stake my life on it. The faith, you might say, of the martyrs ultimately. But what it does mean is that built into the condition of possibility of saying yes to that is the possibility that it's not true. Okay? When young people raise that, we've got to be able to give them a place to be able to say, let's talk that through. Let's work that out. Because that actually can be the catalyst to actually going deeper and not necessarily spinning out. Okay? Especially if what they're doing is that that answers that were previously good enough are no longer good enough. Okay? So it might have been that they say, and a classic one here will be the wrestling around whether science has superseded faith. A young person might, an answer that has been sufficiently good enough where they actually go, these things aren't in conflict or competition. They start understanding a little bit more about science. Their faith understanding hasn't caught up with that, and they think, I don't understand how you can reconcile evolution and creation. Okay? It seemed like the Bible does say God created the world in 6 days and had a rest on the Sunday, or on the Saturday in the Jewish Old Testament. Had a rest, and so how does that work with evolution? How does that work with the Big Bang Theory? And so they actually, whatever answer they did have is no longer sufficient. Well, to be able to, in some ways, not only just kind of give them a chance to explore that, but to actually complexify that a little bit. And I think one of the pathways through this is to actually make the problem a bit deeper rather than try and solve it. So part of that is to say a response might be to say something like, Christians and people of science have not always been opposed, right? You know that the guy who came up with the Big Bang Theory was a Catholic priest. You know that, right? You know that the Vatican has an astronomer. They've got a centre for astronomy. You know that in the Vatican, there's a monument to Galileo. Right? All of these things are saying, you know what, the church actually isn't as scared of science as people sometimes depict it to be. You're complexifying the problem and saying maybe it's a bit more complicated than you think. So you want them to actually go for a deeper answer rather than trying to put forward a more shallow kind of answer. Is there a lot of work in that, informing our youth ministers to be able to handle that? Absolutely. But I don't think there's any getting around that. I don't think there's any way of avoiding the fact that these are not simple questions, and that if we just give a youth minister a simple answer to them, that somehow we're going to make it all right. We're just going to make it harder for them. We've got to help our youth ministers to understand that there's some complexity to this, and for them not to be afraid of it, so they can then help and serve the young people that they're called to minister to. The last point there is simply to say that it's so important for the language of faith that we foster the articulacy of young people. So what I mean by that is that faith grows when we can talk about it. Taylor will say, it's very hard for me to actually meaningfully have an experience if I can't have language, if I can't put language around it. So when young people are actually using the language of faith, when we give them an opportunity to practice testimony of their own, when we give them a chance to articulate what they believe, they're doing something wonderful for others, but they're also forming and shaping their own faith in the process. So we can't have them as passive spectators in that moment. We've got to give them a context to be able to talk. All right. I think I've said something about this already, is that the culmination of this whole process is either the sacraments of initiation at the Easter Vigil for an unbaptised person, or it's appropriation. More we could say, but we'll have to call it. We'll stop there for a second. Where do I want to finish this afternoon? I want to finish with St. Augustine. So Augustine, he wrote many things, but one of his surviving pieces of work that I think is really interesting and significant it's called Instructing Beginners in Faith. It's possibly the only work from the patristic period, from the early centuries of the church, that actually talks about how do you talk to somebody who's not yet a Christian before they've become a catechumen. Surprisingly, perhaps, we don't have too many extant documents other than this one, which makes it a really fascinating one to read. So it comes about because a friend of Augustine's, who's in Carthage, his name is Deogratius, he writes to Augustine and he says, how do I do this? These people want to become Christians. What do I talk to them about? And Augustine, it's a great read and a very readable read. Okay, we're not going to read it today or even go close, but I thought this was a nice spot to end. Sydney in the 21st century is a long way away from Hippo in the late 4th, early 5th century. But I think this is still really relevant. This is Augustine, perhaps if not quite saying to youth ministers, saying to those who would want to help young people and not just the young come to faith. Thus, before all else, Christ came so that people might learn how much God loves them, and might learn this so that they would catch fire with love for him. It's a nice part, isn't it? Who first loved them, and so that they would also love their neighbour as he commanded and showed by his example. He who made himself their neighbour by loving them when they were not close to him, but were wandering far from him. And that's where I'm going to press pause. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.